previously. So that was a bit more in-depth video tutorial on how to actually add background music to OBS for your streams or videos. But I still hope you enjoyed and learned something.
All right, guys, we're going to start in a few minutes here. If you're unable to see the chat, again, I recommend that you log in through a separate Google account into YouTube. We'll give the stragglers about 5 more minutes and then we'll get started. All right, we're ready. What's going on, guys? All right, let me know if the volume is good. Keep in mind that there is a 7-second delay between what I'm doing and what you're seeing and hearing, so do keep that in mind. We could absolutely go over the things you guys are mentioning, no problem whatsoever. If anything is not working, you can't hear me, anything like that, do let me know. If you're getting feedback or anything weird like that, let me know. We should be good, though. Let me just adjust the camera a little bit. Get a little more light in here. There we go. Okay. All right, let's get to it. So first off, what we're going to do is I've got the review sheet loaded up over here just to have something to reference, okay, as we go through. And then also I'll have the ability to sort of keep some notes for us here, just to kind of type things out and so on. And we'll hit up Wikipedia if we need some like maps or something. So we'll just make it work as we go. Okay, so that's the game plan. All right, volume is good. Seem happy. Cool. Okay, let's start with the first code word. The first code word is going to be catfish. Go ahead and type in catfish. I think that's pretty funny. If you do that in the next 30 seconds from the time you hear me say it, then you can have extra credit. Clock is ticking. $20 seconds left. $10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and all right, Kate Morello is going to be our last entry here, and cut here. All right, that's it. Those people made it in. Everybody else is too dang late. All right, I'm going to scroll back up to take a look at your questions, and we'll just kind of take them in order. Some will make more sense than others. I'm kind of scanning them as you put them in because some might make sense to do together, but we'll just get going. Okay, so I've got Sasha asking just modern Africa with a big old question mark. Well, Sasha, there's a lot going on there. Okay, so let's use the review sheet as a kind of a guideline for what has to be sort of gone over and what really doesn't have to be gone over. There's a couple of sort of meta issues, what I'd call bigger issues than Africa issues, or bigger issues than the political issues of Africa. So let's talk about a few of those things. First off, I'm going to stop here on the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution has been one of the success stories of the 20th century where modern technologies, in particular fertilizers, pesticides, things like that, in particular, but also what they might call today frankenseeds. You take a crop seed and you genetically manipulate it to get a bigger crop yield. These are the kind of things that in a developed country like America are often really frowned upon. You have the big organic, non-GMO, non-Monsanto, all those sorts of things being sort of pushed here on a regular basis. But if you're in a developing country and your people are in a state of starvation, or some group of people can't get basic nutritional needs met every day, it's a real position of privilege to sit there and say, hey, it's not good for you to eat a genetically modified rice seed, a genetically modified vegetable. Okay, but it's better to eat that than to not eat, right? So the Green Revolution, I want to make sure you understand, is not a thing that was a modern idea about environmentalism. It's almost the opposite in some ways. It was using the science and technological and chemical, really, advancements of the early 1900s to the mid-1900s to help produce the kind of food supply, food surplus that much of the rest of the developed world has enjoyed for ages now. But the developing world, often because of huge populations and archaic infrastructure, was often struggling with. So I bring it up because it does take place in parts of Africa. It's a big part of some of the way crops are grown in Africa, and it's a feature of kind of Africa in the modern age. Now, going past that, so let's talk a little bit about. Well, we're on the idea of environmentalism, and we're passing it anyway. So Africa has a couple environmental issues worth talking about. Some are man-made, some are not. So you have desertification. So let me pull up a map here for us. Let's get let me get Wikipedia going. So if we go to Wikipedia and we go to a topographical map of Africa, I could have done this with Google Earth too, I suppose, but whatever. Yes, sorta. Alright, 1 second, let me do it this way. Okay. We will use Google Earth after all. Alright, what the hell is this? What is that, Medina? That's Medina. Okay, so you can see it for yourself. I mean, it's right there. There is a big old desert in the northern chunk of Africa, obviously called the Saharan Desert. We've been through that 1,000 times. But it is growing. The process of desertification makes it grow. So you get these kind of climate bands in Africa where, depending upon the season, and that's one of the reasons why a satellite image is not always so great, because this can be dry or wet, depends on the season. But if we zoom in here, you do get, and I mean, we'll take our chances, I suppose. You do get, yeah, we're not going to find too many places we're going to be able to drop the little homie. Well, yeah, we'll try here, see what the heck happens. Over here is like the border region between the desert and some vegetation, and I'm hoping this is not in somebody's house. No, that's good, that works. And you can see it. You get vegetation, right? There is, you can see like weeds growing and things like that, and some small grasses, and you get trees, obviously. This is called the Sahel. This is the region between the Sahara Desert and the Savannah, which is what you like think of with the Lion King, okay? This region is a region in which desertification is ongoing. So as dry desert terrain saps the groundwater out from under it, out from under nearby less desert terrain, because desert is not necessarily an obvious or easy definition sometimes. The bottom line is you end up with the desert growing and more land becoming part of the desert. It's a real problem, particularly in places like this where you can see arable farmland would be in pretty short supply. So one of a great many problems of sub-Saharan Africa is the growing encroachment of the desert in towards Central Africa. Definitely a major problem. Let's get off this and go back to this sheet. Let's talk about these like specific environmental issues. Let's talk about pollution, human pollution. Africa has become a place of development for resource extraction, as well as even some manufacturing. China's trying to make Africa into China's China. Basically, the way we use China to manufacture our goods, China's trying to use Africa for the same thing, as well as resource extraction. So you get a great amount of factories forming there that have no environmental standards whatsoever, and pollution is rampant. The local people there suffer as a result of this, and most of the world, frankly, doesn't really care. Africa is, by any metric you want to measure, the poorest place on Earth. It is the most disease-ridden place on Earth. It is number one in all sorts of terrible diseases: tuberculosis, AIDS, HIV, etc. It's bad all around. And a lot of it has to do with mismanagement. A lot of it has to do with the imperial legacy of Europeans just kind of picking up and leaving and saying the hell with it. There's a lot of that. But even today, you have government mismanagement throughout South Africa, or Africa in general, not just South Africa. South Africa popped in my head because I was actually watching today about how South Africa's electrical grid is on the verge of potentially full-scale collapse. And we talked recently, especially in the global class, the regular global kids, about South Africa's many problems. Despite the fact it has achieved a majority rule by its black South African inhabitants. Now, in terms of conflict, Africa is a war-torn place. A lot of it is warlord violence, meaning you get local pockets of individuals with a lot of followers and the ability to acquire heavy equipment, military equipment, either surplus stuff sold from the Soviet Union or things purchased through illegal arms dealers, or sometimes actually people armed directly from even America and its allies in order to fight groups we don't like. So you do get this. Africa is full of all sorts of really awful interregional violence and intercultural violence. So people who are in many ways the same are divided along lines that in some cases are tribal and therefore traditional, and in other cases are artificial and were drawn by Europeans. One such thing was the Rwandan situation. Now, we went through that when we looked at Hotel Rwanda and the Ghost of Rwanda. But basically, you had this invented group called the Tutsis, which were invented by the Belgians, and another invented group called the Hutus, which were again invented by the Belgians. And the Belgians basically said some people were going to give a small group privileged positions to, and the other group were going to let the privileged black Africans rule. And then the African majority in Rwanda would come to hate their African brethren who the Belgians have put in place, and the Belgians get to sort of sit back and not have to absorb the hatred of both groups at the same time, effectively playing both groups against the middle. It was a common European tactic. The British did this very effectively in South Africa and India and other places. So you do get a lot of that throughout Africa. It's not just in any one place. It's throughout Africa. There are African countries that are far more stable than others, for sure. You have places like Kenya is reasonably stable. Even South Africa, despite its many problems that we were illustrating just as a case study, is still, by standards of Africa, doing better than much of Africa. And then there are places that are just almost too far gone. Places like Somalia may not even... There isn't even a government in Somalia, really. I mean, we have a couple of warlords that the United States talks to, but there's no proper government. So beyond that, there probably isn't any specific modern African issues that are going to come up outside of South Africa, which again, South Africa is sort of the most developed nation, I guess you could say, of sub-Saharan, south of Saharan Africa. That might be not quite true, but it's probably true. And within that, you have the colonial legacy of the Dutch, then the English, then the Afrikaner, native-born whites who ruled the place, put the extreme system of separation in place called apartheid, and then ruled that way until, like I said, until I was in 6th grade. So you're talking 89, I think it was. So absolutely, it is the most meaningful portion of modern Africa that's going to appear on the Regents exam. You're more likely to see stuff from South Africa than really any other place in Africa. If you do see stuff from other places in Africa, it's going to be the same kind of theme. Nationalist leaders demanding Europeans get out and the local people get to rule. All right, that would be sort of the basics of modern sub-Saharan Africa. Places like Egypt, we tend to kind of toss some Middle Eastern history, and I saw people ask about Arab-Israeli stuff, so we'll come back to that, okay? Can we do an overview of the Glorious Revolution, Charles? Sure. So the Glorious Revolution. Glorious Revolution was a changing of power in England. And let me throw some dates on there for you. So basically what had happened is the British monarchs had a history of going back and forth in like the 1500s, 1600s between being Catholics and being Protestants. Now, this really stems from the Protestant Reformation, which is a feature of the exam. So, sorta. Now, keep in mind, the test starts in 1750. So, this is like context information, okay? This is before 1750. So, if it comes up in any respect, it's going to be as context, as background, okay? So, the Protestant Reformation really was something that began in early 1500s. Martin Luther, a German monk, declares that the church really operates outside of the authority granted to it by the Bible, and when you get beyond the Bible, you get into these various other things that the church basically invented. And Luther's attitude was, well, there's no authority by which you get to change these sorts of things, so if it's not in the Bible, it shouldn't count. That was Luther's sort of core philosophy. This balloons into a political mess that causes Germany to be plunged into basically a civil war in which Protestant nobles want to fight really for more independence from their Holy Roman Emperor ruler than anything else. And so war breaks out, and war along the lines of Protestant versus Catholic happens a lot in Europe from that point forward. It's not the only reason people fight, and there are definitely times when Catholics and Protestants join up, so don't get too lost in the weeds. But the Kingdom of England in particular had a kind of really complicated history with this. The most complicated piece being the movement of Protestantism at first was really rejected by the English monarchy. Very, very, very famously, the English monarch who brings Protestantism to England is Henry VIII. Now, this is sort of his latter life sort of portrait here. But he actually, in his youth, was a young, fit, athletic man. And he was even given medals by the Pope for being somebody who spoke out against Luther and had championed the cause of the Catholic Church and the right of the Pope to rule the Church. I mean, he had gotten titles from the Pope and things like that. Okay, very, very famously, he wanted to have a male heir. His first wife was not producing a male heir, considering the fact that this guy had like 7 wives and only had like 1 child that was a male that lived any kind of amount of years. He was clearly the problem, not the women. But nevertheless, he ends up bringing Protestantism to England solely for the reason that because the Pope refused to grant him a divorce. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, a woman of Spain, Princess Catherine of Spain, basically. And no, that might not be I might have the wrong Catherine. I think her name is Catherine. Might not be of Aragon. Either way, he was married to a Spanish princess, and the Habsburg Spanish rulership was allied to the Pope very closely. And this guy was seen as part of that sort of alliance, you know, the good, loyal kings of Europe who are loyal to the Catholic Church and the Pope. But the moment he wants to divorce this woman and the Pope says, no, you're not doing that, sorry, because the Pope had to grant the right to annul a marriage, he decides to say, well, if I'm a Protestant, then I run my own church. You don't have any authority. I can divorce who I want and marry who I want. So kiss my rear, I'm doing it. And that's exactly what he did. And that was the kind of quirky reason why English monarchs became Protestant. However, they don't necessarily stay Protestant. So he ends up leaving behind a daughter. And his daughter becomes the Queen Elizabeth, who dies without an heir because she knew if she had ever remarried, she would lose all her power. She knew that. She understood the world at the time. Very, 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 very smart woman. But having had no heir, now the crown passes to new English families. And these other families have a combination of some are Catholic, some are Protestant. And England at the time, the average person was Catholic. Most were not Protestant. There were some Protestants, but most were not. And whether or not the English government was going to be tolerant of your Protestantism really depended on who was in charge. There were kings that would call for Protestants to be burned. There were kings that would have Catholics executed. It was a very dicey situation. In the end, a civil war breaks out partly along the lines of Protestant versus Catholic, and the Catholic king of England at the time is beheaded. In the midst of all this chaos, there are attempts to effectively solidify the state, and the Parliament does this by reaching out to actually a princess of England who had married into a royal family in the Netherlands and invites that married couple to ascend to the throne of England. This actually is a period that has no bloodshed because the English Civil War had happened not too far before this, and bloodshed had flowed in plenty. The Irish had been prosecuted by a guy named Oliver Cromwell. That was a disaster too. So the Parliament was just looking to settle the country under a partnership with a new set of monarchs. And this partnership created England's constitutional monarchy, where the King and Queen of England rule, but with the consent of Parliament and in partnership with Parliament. And over time, Parliament's power grows. So that's the context to constitutional monarchy. So if you have anything like John Locke questions or anything like that, or constitutionalism or democratic institutions, you can point to the Glorious Revolution and say, hey, that's a contextual element, that's background. And it's certainly outside information in any essay you're going to write. All right, I don't want to spend too long on that. Let's keep going. Collapse of the Soviet Union. All right, sure. So let's go back to the review sheet, because I think the review sheet actually had a good amount of stuff on this. So let's see. There we are. Okay. So it'll be over here somewhere. Nope. Yep, collapse of communism. So I'm just going to leave it right here. What you see here is basically correct. So I don't know why it's in this order, because really it kind of should go... Well, I guess you could do it in this order. Okay, basically here's the deal. Communism as a system applied to governments and applied to people fails every single time. Everywhere it's ever been attempted, it does not single. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work because of a very simple reason. Human beings are not going to carry out a system in which every person from the top to the bottom is going to be fully willing to share everything with everybody else, on top of all the other potential logistical and just realistic issues with communism. It is not a dynamic system. It doesn't encourage anything like innovation. It's very good at shifting large-scale production. It's not good at shifting small-scale production. In addition, such systems require governmental controls. You really can't have large-scale governmental reform because large-scale governmental reform would kill off the government that has to control the system. So you get authoritarian and totalitarian regimes almost lockstep with every single communist regime you'll find anywhere on planet Earth. Whether it's China, North Korea, the Soviet Union, Cuba, anywhere where people toyed with the idea of communism, like sort of like a softer socialist approach or something, often it requires really a dictatorial, totalitarian, authoritarian approach, or it just simply cannot even begin to function. And when you have those systems, bloodshed is inevitable. I mean, we've shown you've seen the documents about, where are the greatest amount of bloodshed here in terms of governmental violence against its own people. And, when it comes to communist states, it's an incredible number. So how does it collapse? It collapses because, one, under the rule of Stalin, the Soviet Union was really not doing particularly well economically. It just wasn't. It wasn't producing enough material goods that people would be able to be satisfied at the same level you could find in developing countries. A place like America or Britain or West Germany could do a much better job of providing a standard of living to the average family. Now, to be fair, in a free market system, there is no safety net, right? So if you're not doing well, or you don't have the skills, or you're physically or mentally handicapped in some way, there is nothing to save you systematically. You just end up in the street, you fail. You're homeless, That's it. Communist systems, or command systems, because really we need to link this into the bottom of the note sheet here when they talk about economy systems. Command systems, and I'll get my fat head out of the way there. Command systems are basically how communist systems work. They are command economies. Command communism. It's where the root word comes from. So when this happens, and don't mind me, I'm just checking the chat to make sure nothing crazy is happening that I didn't know. We're good. Okay. So when communist systems are put in place, they have to run under a command apparatus, meaning the government tells you what to do. Look, we have command apparatuses in the United States all over the place. You go to school in one, all right? A government agency is a command apparatus. The economic decisions made by the school are made by government and by a panel of individuals who decide based on advice, information, the delegation of responsibility, whatever the hell it is. They decide what gets spent and how. That's a command system. That's a governmental system. Well, the problem is that applied to the wider full economy, these systems just don't do it. They just do not provide the same level of standard of living as you'll get in other places. And things like the problems that would emerge in these systems were not honestly debated. Okay, so we'll draw, say, a contrast here with something like China. Okay, so under Stalin, things like the famine in Ukraine. The famine in Ukraine was done as retaliation for what Stalin saw as not sufficiently hardworking Ukrainians. If you think the current fight in Ukraine is just because Putin got up one day and decided I'm invading Ukraine, you're wrong. Ukraine and Russia have a long, bloody history of each other for ages, okay, for absolute ages. They do not get on, and they don't get on because for a long time, especially in the 1900s, Ukraine was well, there's actually even a name for it, so here. It's called the Holodomor. So let me pull it up and I'll show you. There it is. Sorry, I had to do back. Okay, so this is effectively the famine in Ukraine, but this is what it's called. So if you see that word, that's what it's referring to. And this was in the 30s, and basically what happened, well, it was really simple. Stalin didn't like the fact that there were Ukrainians who did not want to be part of his Soviet Union, so he said, okay, fine. Ukraine, by the way, still today, is one of the most productive agricultural centers in the world. The Ukraine, if you do a Google map of it, is like a giant farm. It's basically a giant farm. Here, I'll show you. Again, these little side notes are very helpful in your essay and your writing, because if you bring this stuff up, the graders are not going to expect you to. So if I just go to Ukraine, okay? Take a quick ride. you'll see it's green, and when you zoom in, you'll see it's all boxes. That means it's farmland. All right. So here, I'll just zoom in. It doesn't matter where. Farmland. Everywhere I look. Okay. Farmland. 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 Zoom out. Let's go to a whole other part of the country over here. Farmland. It's a bread box. It really is. The place just grows enormous amounts of crops. That's what it does. All these like segmented areas, it's all agricultural works, farmland, and so on. So Ukraine is a massive producer of food, and Ukrainian grain feeds a lot of Europe. Okay, it was a major part of European, even modern Europe. I mean, one of the reasons why is there's expenses in the supermarkets of European Union countries. A lot of them would import Ukrainian grain because it was a very cheap and abundant source. So yeah, and like I said, I can go basically anywhere I want to in Ukraine, and I'll find more farms. Like it's not hard, it's easy. I know exactly how to find it because the whole place is basically a farm. So these people were essential to Soviet Union diets. Like without Ukrainian grain, the place wouldn't function. So because there were Ukrainians, a growing movement of them, who did not want to be part of the Soviet Union, Stalin's retaliation was to seize their farm produce, give them none, and let them starve. Under like, you will suffer until you turn over the people responsible for this movement. And of course, most people in Ukraine were not responsible for an independence movement. The vast, vast majority of most people just want to live their lives no matter who the hell's in charge of them. So these people were starved deliberately by their government. One of several awful bloodbaths of the Soviet Union on its own people. So these kinds of events more or less spelled the doom for the Soviet system as a whole, because the system would never allow an honest look at things like, well, why doesn't our farmland produce as much as it should? Why do we have people who are still in poverty and we can't get them out of it? Why is our industry not able to keep up with the West? And rather than looking for reforms, things you could change, Stalin was a hardline communist, hardline Marxist. He refused to have those kind of reforms. In fact, Stalin was often very critical of people like Mao, because Stalin looked at Mao as like a low-rent communist who wasn't serious about Marxist traditions. Well, great, but, not that Mao did a great job. Mao was another awful basket case. But if you compare, say, Stalin's rule to a guy like Deng Xiaoping, was a totalitarian, not a good man. But he understood economically. Keeping to a communist Marxist orthodoxy about how to run an economy was not necessarily a good idea. And so the modern Chinese growth that we have today, where China is the second richest nation in the world, is a global power, is a serious threat to its potential neighbors, and at the same time is a essential part of global economics, well, that is mostly because of Deng Xiaoping, by and large, because he took the communist mentality of Mao and discarded it. That kind of really doesn't happen with the Soviet Union until it's too late. What I mean by too late. So too late is in the form of this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev, you should know what he looks like because he can appear on political cartoons. So Gorbachev, most famously, if you see him on a Gorbachev's bald like me, but he's got this big birthmark on his head, like it's a big old birthmark here. There it is. You can see it over here on his head. All right, that birthmark. That birthmark shows up in political cartoons as a quick and easy way of identifying this guy as the Soviet leader, okay? So if you look at Gorbachev political cartoons, I don't know if I'll be able to find something on Wikipedia, so give me a second here. You'll see stuff like this. Like, you'll see the bald spot, all right? It's common. So if you see a bald dude with a bald spot, with a birthmark on his face, on his head like this, that's going to be Gorbachev, okay? So you'll see it here, there. It's going to be Gorbachev. So this is normal. This is, get used to seeing it because it would be him. Now, what about him? Well, here's the thing. Gorbachev was really the first premier of the Soviet Union, the head of the Soviet Union, who, because Stalin, of course, dies like all people die, and then there's a series of other leaders, and he's the last one of the Soviet Union. And he saw reform as necessary. Because he could see the things that other people couldn't see. Information about the state of the country, the economy, the political apparatus, that was kept hidden from the rest of the world. Only the Soviet Communist Party knew it, and even then, only people within who were allowed to know it. So he saw it from the inside out, and he said, obviously it's a failure. Obviously it's falling apart. So what do we do about that? He said, well, reform. Now, he put in two specific reforms, perestroika and glasnost, okay? Glasnost is a little bit easier to understand. Now, the terms are going to show up. They have always historically shown up on the test. Why? I don't know. Probably because Americans used them at the time. Like it was like the words like translated into American media at the time. I don't know why. Because like we would, no other country do we do that. We don't take like Arabic words and use them in the English language to describe Arabic economic policy. But we do it this way. So let's start with glasnost, actually. Glasnost, you see the word glass in there. It's meant to be transparency, all right? The idea was transparency. That you, as a Soviet citizen, should be able to have a greater amount of freedoms in your political activities, including speech and including what the government would let people know is going on. So it was a reduction of that old Stalinist mentality that the people should be kept ignorant. They have no reason to know anything. Only the government needs to know. Which, that notion that the government needs to know and the people don't is very anti-Marxist, frankly. Marx did not like the idea of an elite class ruling anything. He really did not. He called for a proletariat, the average everyday worker, being part and parcel with a almost democratic style movement where everybody would be voting and working together. But the simple reality is it's never been implemented that way because it really can't be implemented that way. You're not going to get direct democracy in a system that shares equally with all. Just go find it and let me know when you do, because it doesn't exist. But this was a major step towards giving people in the Soviet Union for the first time the right to see and to criticize the government. This was a dangerous thing to do before this time. Like today in China, you can't criticize the Chinese government. There is no equivalent in China today. You cannot. You go into China, you criticize the government, you're vanishing. It's that simple. And I've shown you many examples of that. Perestroika, excuse me. Sorry. Perestroika is the economic reform. This was the idea that they needed to be a drawing. This is more like Deng Xiaoping. This is draw back away from that the communist system, the command system, and bring in more free market operations within government. Too little, too late to save the political power of the Soviet Union, realistically. Deng Xiaoping was able to do this in China, but he did it, really as early as a decade and a half before this, because remember, Mao was out for a little bit there, okay? Not true with the Soviet Union. They just waited too long. So could the Soviets have had a kind of a Chinese-style authoritarian state that runs over a mix of communism, socialism, and free market economics? Potentially, but it was over and done by then. It was simply too late. And so it does fail. It also doesn't help that the Soviet Union had absorbed a number of independent countries that simply had no desire at all ever to have been part of this union. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, frankly. They didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. So you had nationalist independent movements within these places that want the Soviets out. East Germany, of course, half of Germany, that want the Soviets out. And unlike China, where China does control some foreign territory and things like Tibet, China doesn't control, Japan. China doesn't control, I guess it controls parts of Mongolia, but it doesn't control, Vietnam. It has close relations with these people, but China has always had those relations. Russia has never really had that expansion west, historically. So all these things combine to eventually lead to the full collapse of the Soviet system, and you get a new nation called Russia, which is what you see today. Russia today is still run largely by the individuals who once, it's kind of like a sort of a two groups that run Russia today. One are the former government and intelligent agents that have been able to maintain power in that transition. Putin was an ex-KGB. KGB is basically like CIA, but for the Russians, for the Soviets, in conjunction with business owners and business interests in Russia, especially in the field of oil and natural gas extraction and things like that. Russia is loaded with a lot of minerals, of resources. So that's kind of the basics. Moving on, we've got what the Soviets do. Well, this is part of the collapse. So just like America had the war in Vietnam, which America went into in an attempt to stop communism and then prevent it spreading, and we failed at that. We ended up losing that war effectively. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan with the intent of occupying it, potentially even with the attempt of using it as a gateway into India, potentially. and maybe even further Middle Eastern expansion. And this was something where the United States funded Afghanistan's local people to fight the Soviets. The local people were known as a group of fighters called the Taliban. Later, the Taliban will be the same Taliban that we help defeat the Soviets. The Soviets retreat. The Taliban take over the state of Afghanistan, and they stay there, largely ignored by the United States for, 20 years. And then, come 9/11, the Al-Qaeda terrorist group that attacked the Twin Towers was being sheltered by the very group, the Taliban, that was now running Afghanistan and we had put there. So, bit of a legacy there. But that's what Afghanistan basically was. They tried to invade it and the Soviets failed in that. What is OPEC? OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC is what you call a cartel. So have you ever heard the phrase drug cartel? Drug cartel is not a specific thing. A cartel is a way of doing business. It's a mechanism for controlling a market. So here's OPEC. I'm sure I can find a list of the nations on here pretty. I'll just scroll around. So they're not all Middle Eastern countries, but they're mostly Middle Eastern countries. Here we go. So here's your OPEC nations, okay? There are African countries. There's even some South American countries like Venezuela. But the OPEC is largely led by Saudi Arabia, who is the largest producer single largest producer of oil in this cartel. What a cartel does, a cartel meets and agrees to set prices and production methods in order to control their profits. So basically, if you're an OPEC, very simplified, if you're Saudi Arabia and you're concerned that the price of oil has gone down, you might call a meeting of OPEC and say, listen, price of oil is going down. Our wealth is based on the price of oil. We want the price of oil to be high. So we're going to go ahead and ask everybody here to stop making oil, create a supply shortage that will drive up prices. Now, if you try to do this with like an American business, like if you were a group of airlines and you try to do this, although it may not be the best actual example because they kind of do this, but say you did. If you had a meeting where the airlines all got together and said, listen, we want to jack up the price of fares and we need to make sure that we're doing that. So everybody here, man, we're all going to agree to raise the prices. That would actually be illegal in America. It's called collusion. You're not allowed to do that. But on an international stage, there is really no such thing as international law. You can write an international law. The only way to enforce it is to start wars. So most times they're not enforced. So OPEC operates with basically impunity. They can do what they want. In reality, it's not as effective as it sounds. In reality, it's all well and good for one of these states to say, well, you know what? We should stop producing oil. Let's make the rest of the world spend more money on oil. All right, do that. But then what might happen is a place like, I'll pick one off the list, a place like the United Arab Emirates might find that all of a sudden the United States withdraws some of its assistance for financial aid, or for, if you're an African country, all of a sudden the United States says, oh yeah, you're going to raise the price of oil? Okay, no more foreign aid for your country until the price comes down. Like, you get that hardball politics that happens. So in reality, some of these countries might say, yeah, you know what, we're going to keep producing. Sorry, we're not going to listen. So it's not quite as well controlled as it may sound on paper. Think about how easy is it for you and your friends to agree to go to Applebee's again for half apps. You argue for 45 minutes, you end up doing it anyway. Now imagine we're talking about billions of dollars of oil production. It's going to be more than a 45-minute conversation. What else? Can we go over the totalitarian dictatorships that were established between World War I and World War II? Sure. Specifically the ones between World War I and World War II. Let's go ahead and throw the Soviets in there just because they're in the middle of World War I. So you have the Soviet Union, totalitarian dictatorship run by Vladimir Lenin and then by Joseph Stalin and then his successors. Those two are worth noting because they're both brutal dictator totalitarians who engage in active physical violent suppression of their own peoples, murders, fake trials, things like that. Their successors, the people that come after Stalin, largely dial back some of that stuff, not totally, but largely. Especially the worst of the Stalinist regime's programs of like pogroms and things like that. That stuff gets dialed back. So those are the two worst. In Italy, of course, you have the foundation of Mussolini's fascist state. Fascism is actually an Italian term. It comes from the Roman symbol, the fasces, which was a bundle of sticks with an axe in it meant to represent the power to kill and the power to forgive. Getting hit with a stick was forgiveness for a state, and Mussolini used Rome as a kind of like a rallying cry for Italians. It was like, you know why we suck? Because we abandoned our traditions. Our traditions were Roman traditions. And we need to be strong. And the Romans were militaristic. And the Romans were this. And the Romans were that. And he pushes this narrative and is able to push it successfully enough that he's able to get himself into power and run the country effectively into the ground and then get beaten to death by baseball bats. Yes, that is how Mussolini died. And then you've got Hitler's Germany, obviously. Now, Germany, Hitler's Germany is, we've gone over many times. You went to the Holocaust Museum. I don't want to downplay it, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. I think most of you could come up with 2 or 3 individualized facts about the Holocaust that you could use on a moment's notice. Let me just say, and I mean this in all sincerity, if you have an opportunity to write about something, and Hitler or the Holocaust or something like that is a possible thing you could write about, I suggest you take it. For most of you, it's something you know a good amount about. Use it. Don't try to do the hardest, most complex, most fringe thing. Do the simplest thing. We don't give you more points because you did an obscure topic. You know, if you go, if you get to write about, I don't know, a nationalist independence leader in the 20th century, and 90% of the class is doing Gandhi, but you're like, nah, chill, I want to do Jomo Kenyatta. You're a fool. I'm sorry, but you are. Like, this is a test. You're getting graded on it. There's no award. There's no medal for trying the hardest difficulty. Do it the easiest, most direct way. Score the points and move on with your day. Okay. So those dictatorships obviously were, with the exception of the Soviets, dismantled in the course of World War II, and they didn't survive it. And they, I'd like to tell you that the world learned a lesson, but the world didn't learn a lesson because we have plenty of totalitarian dictatorships that still exist today. Since then. Age of absolutism. So the age of absolutism, you got to go back to the very beginning of the course. This would have been something you would have covered in the end of 9th grade, beginning of 10. Absolutism is a European political philosophy that God, the Christian God, is 3 things. Omniscient, meaning all-knowing. Omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. And omnipresent, meaning at all places, everywhere, at all times. God is a transcendent being. So, if such a creature is in fact out there in some capacity and is perfect in all ways and knows all things, by all I mean that which is, was, and is yet to come, and add to this, this is a being of total and complete love, because that's the Christian tradition, that God is a being of love. Well, if that's the case, then certainly if God lets me be your teacher, this must be the best thing. It must be what God wants. Because if God didn't want me to be your teacher, when God loves you, so he wants the best for you, if I'm not the best thing for you, then I would have a heart attack or lose my job or be replaced. Right? The fact that none of the things have happened means that not only am I where I'm supposed to be, but God wants me to be here. And since God wants me to be here, I have God's authority. And since I have God's authority, you better not question me. Because if you question me, you're not screwing up with me. You're screwing up with God, and that's a bigger problem, right? So that was the move. That's the logical progression of absolutism. If I may say so, it's not insane. If you take from a core of standard that almost everybody in that era believed in a Christian God in Europe, almost everybody, the idea of an atheist was really not yet a thing. So religion's a part of everybody's life. Everybody, especially the common man, accepts God like they accept the sun rising in the morning. Okay, then therefore there is some logic that if this is the God we all worship, why would God let me rule if I was a terrible person? Well, that's absolutism. Absolutism, I'll say it and bring it up because might as well, is dismantled by the Enlightenment. Now you could say the Enlightenment might have been kind of like the one unique European event that changes the trajectory of Europe from every other place on planet Earth. Because it was an event where Europeans self-selected, not right away, it took time, but self-selected logic and reason, the Greek sort of hallmarks of Western civilization, logic and reason to triumph over superstition and faith. Now, that's a weird dynamic, but true. So what do I mean by that? Well, the church made declarations of things that were simply not provable. The church would say, I'll give you a simple one, the earth is no one still believed the Earth was flat at that point, but people did believe like the Earth was the center of the universe. Okay, well, observationally, if you look at the sky and you see the sun and clouds and everything spinning around, it's easy to conclude that all right, we must be the center. Everything else is moving. We're stationary. Cool, makes sense. And if you're a Christian, or if you're a church, and you're like, well, God favors humanity above all things, well, it makes some sense. The problem, of course, is that that's just an error of the way that these things work. Sorry, I'm getting a little notification here. I want to make sure it's something I can ignore. Very much so. Okay, never mind. Sorry about that. So, the Enlightenment took logic and reason and basically challenged superstition and challenged the claims of the church and said, look, prove it. That's all. Prove it. The burden is on you. You're making an extraordinary claim. God wants you to rule. Fan-freaking-tastic. Please show us the evidence. And the evidence was not really, well, if you look at this logical progression of beliefs, then therefore, obviously, it's true. Well, no, it's not so true. Show us evidence. And that became the real hallmark of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment came down to this idea. And you do get thought patterns out of it that are utterly critical to global history, like John Locke's natural rights. The idea like, well, wait a minute, who the hell actually is? What is a human? What makes a human special? Is a human special compared to other creatures on Earth? And John Locke says, yes, they are. Regardless of their faith, regardless of their station, their circumstances, their nation, their origin of birth, that's not an issue. What's at issue is a human has 3 natural rights: life, liberty, and property. And those cannot be violated unless they're being violated to protect the natural rights of somebody else. So if I'm a government and I say, well, God chose me, so I get to throw you in jail forever, and that's it, and I'm, of course, morally correct because God chose me, John Locke would say, no, that's a violation of that person's natural rights. So unless that person is doing something to endanger other people's natural rights, so for example, if I try to kill you and you lock me up, well, I was trying to take your life, so you have a right to retaliate and defend yourself, or more to John Locke's liking, because he's not an anarchist, the state has a role to create a law that would stop and punish me from trying to kill you. That my natural rights are not without those limits because they only exist to the point where they come into conflict with your natural rights. So that's a key feature of the Enlightenment and one of the things that really breaks down absolutism as a system. So there's that. The Israeli conflict. I'm going to hold off on that for a moment. We will come back to it because I see some other stuff that's a little bit closer to the timeline we're talking about. But I do see it, Katie. We will do it. Unification of Italy and Germany. So remember how Italy and Germany formed totalitarian regimes during World War I to World War II era. Prior to World War I, there was the formation of Italy, the country, and Germany, the country. Their stories are fairly similar. Germany was definitely the more powerful state. After Napoleon conquers chunks of Austria and chunks of the Prussian Empire, he is able to conquer what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which was all these various German states. And so rather than let them continue to exist as a Holy Roman Empire, he dismantles the thing and calls it the Confederation of the Rhine being a river in Germany. And a confederation is just a group of allied states like it was in the United States for the Confederacy. Well, a Confederation of the Rhine meant that all these independent little states, and there were hundreds of them, would rule independently, and Napoleon would have like an overseer who ran the whole thing, and that would be how it worked. Napoleon, of course, is defeated, and Austria ends up taking over the Confederation of the Rhine and ruling it. For the Prussians, who were Germans, Prussians with a P, not Russians, they viewed the whole thing as a mess. And so they wanted to create a unified German state under their leadership full of German-speaking people. And so they do. Under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck as the prime minister and Kaiser Wilhelm as the Kaiser, the emperor of Germany, they create Germany. Italy has kind of a similar legacy. Italy is ruled by a bunch of foreigners. The king of Sardinia, which is an island to the west of Italy, actually ends up leading a series of armies that conquer northern Italy. There is a peasant revolution that sort of throws out the French in southern Italy. There is a meeting of the minds, and they all agree, let the king rule. And so this new king of not Italy rules Italy, and now we call the whole place Italy. All right, that's what those unification movements are. Nationalism drove them together because nationalism was the thing that gave people a reason to root for the flag and not for your lord, your baron, or your neighborhood, right? If America, the flag is winning, you're winning. If you're Irish and the flag of Ireland is winning, you're winning. That's nationalism, right? Latin American revolutions. Okay, let's Let's do nationalism in Ireland, potato famine, just because we already were discussing it. So nationalism in Ireland. So Ireland's a complex history. I'll give you a little bit, but then I'll tell you it's probably not going to come up in any major way in the exam. But Ireland, I'll pull it up on a map, is actually two places. It's two countries. So we go to Ireland. There is a section of the island of Ireland that is ruled still by Britain as part of Great Britain. Okay? So you see Ireland and Ireland, that's not a mistake. All right? So can I get political boundaries on here? I probably. Hang on. Okay, I'm not going to go crazy. If I can't find it right away, I'm not going to try. Okay. Hey, let's do another extra credit code. Everybody type in bacon. Everybody type in bacon. Let's see who's still here. If your name is not a name I recognize, please put your name in there, or at least your first name, so I can give you credit. Because some of you have a name here that's not your class name. So I don't know who Tim Hammer is, but he's gonna have to tell me his name, or I'm not gonna be able to give him his credit. – 15 seconds. Oh, hello, Scholar. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and cut. Okay, cool. Oh, all right. Well, you already had your name in there, right? The rest of you are sleeping. Sleeping. Oh, that's not fair, I guess. I got a 7-second delay. All right. Here. Now I'll cut. I forgot I have a 7-second delay. I'm typing cut on something that's live. Meanwhile, I have a 7-second delay. That's not fair. All right. So on the map here, you see the Republic of Ireland, which is the independent country of Ireland, and then what's called Northern Ireland, which is one of the provinces of the United Kingdom. As you can imagine, this is a good example of nationalism. So as late as the 1970s, there were active terrorist activity, bombings, and so forth in Northern Ireland in an attempt to, particularly Belfast, as an attempt to get rid of the British as rulers of this place. Eventually, an agreement had to be reached called the Good Friday Agreement, which allowed for a kind of a co-government. So Ireland actually has, Northern Ireland, the UK part of Ireland, actually has its own little independent local government, kind of like a governor in New York State would have kind of thing. And it has a lot of self-rule, which has allowed it to kind of keep on going as it is. But I'm not going to get too much into that because, again, it's not really going to be a thing that comes up on the Regents, I don't think, in any great capacity. I would be stunned. Now, the potato famine is a different matter. The potato famine could also come up on the U.S. Regents because it was a big driver for immigration to the United States. But as you can see, mid-1800s, basically, a disease took root in the potato crop of Ireland. Keeping in mind that we talked about how important potatoes were to all Northern Europeans post-Columbian exchange, right? So Northern Europeans relied heavily on potatoes because they were a crop that provided ample carbohydrates. Remember, every society anywhere, if it wants to get anywhere and do anything, needs a surplus amount of carbohydrates that you could feed in mass to a population. You can't do mass meat to a population. It's just not sustainable. It can't be done. All right, it requires modern factory farming like we have today, and even then, go look at what a box of mashed potatoes costs you. Go look at what a potato costs you, a 5-pound sack of potatoes, which you could theoretically eat for a week and a half, right? I mean, how many mashed potatoes would that make? A lot. A single potato could probably be a reasonable meal for most or less anybody. It's very filling, yeah? Well, imagine that, right, being, what could that cost you now? $3, $4, $5? Really, that'd be about it. A very small steak, yay big, could be $33, depending, and that's uncooked, right? So And of course, it won't keep as long, and so on. Potatoes were a solution to a long problem where Northern Europeans did not have an easily able to be sustained carbohydrate. But of course, once you become reliant on that thing, if anything bad happens to that thing, you got a real problem. And that's exactly what happened with the potato famine. Basically, a lot of the potato crop was diseased and failed, and as a result, there was mass starvation. There were attempts to even offset it. Like America sent corn to Ireland even to try to offset the potato famine. Like we would send bushels and bushels and bushels of corn to Ireland to help feed them, and the Irish did in fact use it in a lot of their meals and cooking. But you know it. There's also a bit of a thing about the Irish using it to make whiskey too, but I don't know. That could be racism also. But anyway, so that's the potato famine. It was a situation that resulted in a lot of immigration out of Ireland. A lot of that immigration came towards the United States. That was where you had that wave of Irish immigrants coming to the Americas. This was the cause of that. All right, we'll go back up here before the bacon, before the catfish. Okay. Let's see. I skipped Latin America and I skipped Israel. Let's do Latin America. Okay. So Latin American revolutions are a kind of a complicated thing. So for one, if we just do, sure. It's not one for one. It's several. Okay. This map works. We'll use this. Yeah, that works. So Latin America is complicated. For one, it's not like as clean cut as say in India or Africa, where Europeans are here, they're running it, nobody wants them here, and get out, and then they leave and poof. Nah, Latin America is way more complicated than that. For one, remember this. This is excellent context. Latin America was dead, right? Like, what is Latin? Latin is Europeans. So why is it called Latin America? Because the people who lived there were killed by smallpox. That's why. Humongous percentages of native peoples south of what we today call the United States were decimated by smallpox. We know that 80 to 90% of the population in total died off. We know this. We also know that there was you cannot sustain a culture like that. You can't. If I take any group of people who have a set of beliefs, values, etc., and I remove 90 to 80% of them, it's gone. I take your friend circle, any friend circle, and I take 80% of them. Say you got 10 friends, I take 8 of them and ship them off to college somewhere. Your friend circle disintegrates. It's gone. Why? Because there's not enough left to maintain the traditions that the friends used to do. There's not enough left to maintain those bonds. It just isn't. And especially on a cultural level, culture is passed father to son, mother to daughter, child to brother to brother, sister to... It's a family thing. If families are dying and neighborhoods are dying, communities are dying, and they're dying to smallpox of all things, you can't fight smallpox, you can't resist smallpox, you can't generate a anti-imperialist movement against smallpox. It's just smallpox. It just does it. Boom, they're dead. Now, compound that with the fact that Europeans who did rule the place were a very small minority, right? Very small. But also were not people of wealth and means. The original people who came over, remember, I tried to make this point at the time. If you're going to get on Columbus's ship, you are probably scum of the earth. What in the hell is going on in your life that getting on Columbus's boat is your best option? I mean, this would literally be like Elon Musk says, listen, I got this plan. I want to colonize Mars. Who wants to be the first person to get on the rocket that goes there? Hey, look, we know where Mars is right there. Want to get on the rocket? If you say yes, you're either the kind of person who wants to do base diving off of buildings with parachutes, or your life is in distress and there is nothing better for you to do because you're either a criminal on the run, saddled with debts, have no better options in front of you. Like, you have to be remarkably unstable that getting on the moon, the Mars rocket seems like a good idea because you're probably going to die. Most of the guys who jumped on Columbus's ship thought he was probably going to die. The reason the Spanish government was the only one that gave him any sort of look was because all they had to do was hand him 3 ships. And if the ships never come back, okay, moderate loss, no big deal. It was an easy bet for them. No government was financing this crap at the time. The Portuguese were letting people sail around Africa, but they knew Africa. It's right there. And it was baby steps. The idea you were going to send a bunch of competent, really with it, government agents, military men, etc. on naval vessels across the Atlantic Ocean into maybe no man's land. No freaking way. Wasn't going to happen. So, the guys who get here stay here. They don't go back. Because when they get here, they conquer and become conquistadors, right? They become landowners. They become what they weren't never going to be back home in Spain. They are now landholding elites, and they stay that way. These landholding elites are not going to be able, largely, some exceptions, of course, but mostly, not going to be able to import white European women to come live with them here. Why would they? Again, most white European women at the time that these guys would have an interest in at this point, because they're very wealthy now, were not going to go to the New World to go live. It was very unlikely. So instead, you get white Europeans and their native, now conquered peoples, and you get children from that. And those children start to become, racially classified in one way or the next. Even if they were white people who had, a white European and a white European had a child, that child was still racially classified below European whites. So there was a lot of this racial categorization. Remember, it was called the castas system, where if you pull up the castas, here's the castas. This is still one of my favorite documents, maybe the entire course. I just think it's so profoundly cool. So I can't zoom too much more in. There we go. So if you have a Spaniard and an Indian meaning a native, because remember, Columbus thought he was in the East Indies, so Europeans called all these people Indians. It was wrong, but, it stuck. So if you have a Spaniard who gets with an Indian, the child that pops out is a mestizo. And if you have a mestizo that gets with a Spaniard, the child that pops out is a castizo. And if a castizo gets with a Spaniard, Spaniard, right? Then that kid's now white again, right? so see how that works. So a white guy has a baby, and if the baby is sufficiently white and keeps getting whiter and whiter, then eventually they're back to being white again. This was the system, and it goes all the way down. You get gypsies, you get Lobo is gypsy, you get gypsies, you get black African slaves. Of course, we'll talk about those in a minute. So this is all part in what brings the Latin American Revolution to sort of its place. Now, on top of that, speaking of slavery, with the population decimated, you need workers for fields, for plantation farming, for mining. So where are they going to come from? They come from Africa. We know that the source of the triangular trade, the African slave trade over the Atlantic Ocean, was absolutely the direct result of the deaths caused by smallpox. So the slave trade is absolutely a part of that. So that when you get to Latin America in 1800, as you see in the map on the left, Latin America in 1800 is not a homogenized place. It's a place of many, many different racial breakdowns, categorizations, and so forth. It's gotten so much so that the categories almost have no meaning. In general, you have an educated class of people who brought the Enlightenment thinking of Europe back to the colonies, and this educated class starts to realize, hey, wait a minute, why the hell should we be second-class citizens to our Spanish masters over there? We should run our own country. Free, natural rights, self-determination, etc. And this is partly what leads to eventually revolutionary movements against the local Spanish governments. This is a little complicated because a place like Brazil, for example, actually for a while housed the royal family of Portugal because they were fleeing Napoleon and a few other things were going on. So it's a little bit of a story, but in short, because there really wasn't a native population to hurl out white folk, that by the time you get to 1800, you've got a bunch of people from all over the world that have intermarried and intermingled, and they're all here. It's really more about the educated versus the non-educated. The figure central to this movement is Simón Bolivar. You could certainly make the case that even before him, Toussaint Louverture in the Haitian Revolution was even more profoundly important, because he sets up the notion that there was not going to be European intervention in revolutions in this area. Remember, this is all post-American Revolution, right? So the British have already demonstrated a failure to stop a revolution in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, the Atlantic Ocean is a big reason for that. It's hard to do anything across an ocean. And so a lot of these European states mostly Spain, that really didn't have it within them the capacity to go and, in many cases the colonies were more important than the mother country in Latin America. What's more important, Portugal or Brazil? Brazil still today. What's more important, Spain or the entirety of the Western Hemisphere minus the very tippy top of North America? It's kind of obvious. So, in reality, these places become independent. Simon Bolivar tries to forge a single empire out of it all. It fails. He then goes from being a democratic advocate to like a totalitarian to try to force the issue. Still fails. But that's more or less how Latin American revolutions go down. We'll come back to Israel again, like I said. Bolsheviks, yeah. So the Bolsheviks were the the communist Soviets that ended up taking over for the Tsar. They threw the Tsar out of power. We talked about this. Took the Tsar out of power, brought his wife and children into house arrest, eventually execute the wife, execute the children, execute the Tsar and his son, and end up establishing the Soviet Union. Most notably, the guy who did this is Vladimir Lenin. He ends up cutting a deal with the Germans, the World War One, not before Hitler. This is before Hitler Germans, to stop Russia's fight with Germany in World War One, because the Soviets viewed it as, this is not our problem, this is not our fight, we didn't do this. Talk to the West. We're a new batch of people in charge here, and that is the Bolshevik Revolution. In a nutshell, it leads to violence and bloodshed, particularly against landowners in Russia, even poor landowners, a group called kulaks, which were basically farmers that had been a little more successful than their neighbors. Maybe like the most successful farmer in a particular town might own a couple of fields and a few extra livestock, were targeted as enemies of the state for having excess wealth, and were in most cases just murdered and their property seized. The Soviet transition from Tsarist Russia into Soviet Russia was not a very pleasant one. We did unification of Germany. I'm going to do Latin America, not Israel. I'm just going to go down here. All right, feel free to type in more questions. I'm going to start talking about modern Israel, okay? This is a little bit deep in the weeds, but we'll go. If you got more stuff, let's do it. If it looks like no one's going to do more stuff and we end up stopping at 9:30, we end up stopping at 9:30. An hour and a half's not bad. And we are going to do this a few more times, okay? Let's go ahead and do modern Israel. Okay. This document has a very decent chance of being on the Regents. Very decent. In fact, just like that. It's one of those famous documents in the 20th century. This document is called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was written by a guy named Balfour. Balfour is the English, I'm talking a lot over the last 2 hours here, is the English head of Secretary of State, basically Foreign Affairs Office. He's like the equivalent of the Secretary of State in America. He handles all foreign affairs. And within England, there was a group of people that we call today Zionists. Now, what are Zionists? Zionism, or Zionists, are mostly Jewish people who believe in the biblical concept of a Zion. Zion meaning that there is a homeland, Zion meaning homeland, for the Jews, traditionally in modern Palestine. So, if we go over here to Palestine, oh, Jesus God. Okay, here's Palestine right here. That was lucky. So, Palestine is basically, here's the Eastern Mediterranean. You've got Saudi Arabia down here. You've got Egypt over here. You can see the Nile Delta. Sinai Peninsula. And then right in here is where you get here. Yeah, but I want political borders, you bastard. Hoping to find a way to just turn on political borders. I don't know if I can. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Good. Okay. So it still might be a little hard to see on the stream, but here's Israel, and you can kind of see the white line borders here. I'm sorry, it's going to be a little bit tricky, but this is Israel right here. Israel is this entire business up to this northern border here. Now, if you see, and it kind of showed it pretty well there. Oh, darn, it went away. Hold on. Some of these borders are not particularly written in stone. And why is that? Because like America, we don't have any doubts about where our borders end to begin. Like they're on a map, at least they're very clear. Well, let me explain. So, the Zionist movement believed that there needed to be a traditional return of Jews to their traditional homeland. We're going way back in history now, so strap in. The Jews historically lived in this region I just showed you on the map. The Romans called this region Judea. They named it after the Jews that mostly lived there. Now, this is an era before Christianity. This is an era before Islam. There is no Muhammad. There is no Jesus. This is Judea. So the only real monotheistic faith of the time are Jews. And if you really want to kind of stretch the definition of monotheism, you can maybe talk about Persians or Zoroastrians. But for the most part, Jews. So, historically, did Jews occupy and live in this region? Yes. No question about it. Sure. Go back far enough. This is where they're from. Those biblical stories of Nazareth and Jerusalem and Bethlehem, this is the place. Those places are still there. This is the spot. Okay, cool. Now what? Well, there was an attempt by a group of Jewish fundamentalists. I mean, they were basically like religious fanatics that felt like the Roman occupation of Judea was a sin, delaying the arrival of the Mashiach. The Mashiach is the Jewish term that that Christians call Messiah. So, have you ever heard the term Messiah applied to Jesus, the Christian Jesus? It's actually a Jewish phrase, and it just means king. Just means king. The Jews typically, even today, interpret Mashiach or Messiah as a political leader, like an actual king. Christians don't. Christians reinterpreted it as like the Jesus as king, which of course he's not a political leader of anything. He's executed by the Romans. He's, basically dies destitute and powerless. But the idea that he's king in heaven or king of humankind in some spiritual, emotional, mental capacity, that's the Christians reinterpret this. So, these fundamental Jews, and this is way back in the days of, BC era, launch a revolution where they seize a Roman fortress called Masada and they take the place over. And they basically tell the Roman legion, come and get some. Well, the Roman legion comes and gets some. And the Roman legion brings catapults and siege equipment, and it's an ugly fight because Masada is on this big old hill. It's a big hill fort. And basically the Romans take their time more or less bombarding the place until they very slowly make their way up the hill. It takes several weeks. And by the time they get up there and breach the fortress, every Jew inside has killed themselves, committed suicide in a pact to resist Roman occupation to the end. Okay, cool. The Romans' reaction to this is simple. It was very Roman. It wasn't anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. It was what the Romans did. The Romans had a very simple philosophy. Don't start none, won't be none. If you pay your taxes, follow Roman laws, and don't act a goddamn fool, we ain't going to bother you. That was the Roman way. Well, anyone in the Roman Empire who did not follow those basic three rules, like having revolutions, would always be punished severely. So what the Romans did was they felt like this was a systematic problem of monotheistic Jews who, remember monotheism, monotheists have to say you're wrong. They have to. If you're a polytheist, right, so you believe in whatever, many gods, or even like a more modern version of something like that, like a Wiccan, you believe in Wiccan theology. A monotheist has to believe not just that they're right, but you're wrong. Because if you're right, then there's more than one God. That can't happen. So every monotheist comes built in with the theology that everyone else is wrong. So the Jews believed that. Everybody else was wrong. There's only one God. But the Romans didn't care if the Jews believed that, as long as the Jews didn't act on that. But these Jews acted on that. So the Romans said the Jews are a dangerous thing. So what they did was they forced the Jews to get out of Judea. Not all of them, but many. They were picked up, put on boats, and shuffled all over the empire. Many into slavery. This was called the diaspora. Now, diaspora is just a word. It's not specific or unique to this issue. Diaspora just means a cultural spreading of people around the world. Some diaspora is voluntary, like the Irish potato famine was a diaspora. Some diaspora is involuntary, like Jews being removed from Judea by the Romans, or the African slave trade, or Mongols forcing various cultures to move around their empire to serve their political needs. These are diaspora, okay? Spreading of people around the region or around the world from their traditional homelands, either voluntarily or involuntarily. That's a diaspora. So, anyway, fast forward, the Romans go away, and eventually Muslims take over this part of the world and largely rule it from, let's just throw a number out there, 650 to very modern day. Very modern day, like until the Ottomans fall. So like 1915, 1918. I mean, really, very modern day. So in the latter part of this era, obviously 1917, as World War I's coming to a close, and as the Ottomans are clearly going to be losing here, this particular Jew, who was a British citizen, but also a very big person involved in the Zionist movement of bringing Jews back to the homeland of Israel, asked the British government to support the idea of creating a Jewish homeland in their traditional home of Palestine. Now, Jews have not traditionally ruled Palestine at this point. 2,000 years, give or take, is about how long it's been since the Jews have ruled Palestine in any capacity. Jews have lived there throughout the entire period, but so have Christians and so on, and Muslims have ruled it largely. This letter was Balfour's response to Rothschild, saying, yes, our government will back you, and you could tell the other Zionist Jews in the nation of England, UK, that we back you. This is a problem for two reasons. One, at the same time, the British are making promises to Arabs saying, hey, if you help us defeat the Ottoman Empire, who are Turks, and you Arabs don't like Turks, you're all Muslims, but you don't like the Turks, help us defeat them, rebel against them, and we will give you your own countries in this region. We'll give you independent rule. That included in the same region of Palestine the British have promised to the Jews. So the British promised the Arab Palestinians, you'll have a country. The British promised the Jews, you'll have a country. Well, World War I ends, and the British don't give it to either one. The British just keep it. They run it themselves. There is a lot of Jews that say, well, if we keep moving in, the British will have to honor their deal. So Jewish migration to Palestine picks up a lot. The Jews are a more politically potent force in England than Arabs are. There are not many Arabs in England at this time. There are a great many Jews in England this time, and the British government responds to Jewish demands more consistently. Fast forward again to now World War II, and of course the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust was over, there was a very, very big sense in the world that a collective guilt about letting the Jews get slaughtered like this. This guilt helped push the notion that, you know what, we probably should make good on that promise. Let's establish a Jewish state, because the Jews are saying there's so few of us left now. We need a right to have a place where we can defend ourselves, and we're not at the mercy of some government of people who don't care about us or view us as a minority problem within their government. And that led to the creation of the State of Israel. This was not a very popular thing, because the State of Israel so the establishment of Israel was not popular because every Arab nation in the UN at the time was basically saying, no, that is Arab land. It's been traditionally Arab land for ages, or at least Muslim land. Certainly the Jews did not have it. Arabs have lived here forever, and we demand that we rule the place ourselves. Jews are welcome to live here, but it's going to be our place to rule. The Europeans did not go for that. They gave it, they quite literally gave it to the Jews. Well, the result was an immediate war, like immediate. So, 1 second. So, 1948, several Arab countries attack Israel. Israel is at this time backed more or less by the United States and Britain, and is given modern military equipment, and is able to not only win, but actually advance into the territory of these Arab countries and take more land than was originally drawn. So some of the land that Israel controls today was actually taken in a counterattack to this war. I'm sparing you some details because it's super dense, but today this is still a problem. There is a state of Israel. It is run by Jews. the Jews control. Well, no, it's run by the people in it, which are majority Jew. There are parts within Israel that are considered refugee camps that have become permanent residence installations. They're not very nice. They're what the Jews themselves at one time referred to as a ghetto ages ago. There is a lot of terrorist activity coming out of these refugee Palestinian Arab camps against the Jewish state. There are military retaliations from the Jewish state against these camps. It's hard to pick good guys and bad guys in a conflict like this, and historically, you really don't want to do that until you've had a situation like that resolve, and you give it 20 or 30 years and see like what the facts look like when they're a little bit more clear. But for now, this is an active and ongoing problem of tension between these groups, and it's not looking to resolve anytime soon. America views Israel as a necessary and super important ally in the region, made even more important since 9/11. Because the thought is we have a democratic partner there who has a shared cultural system. Jews and Christians have a shared cultural Western system, same values and so forth, more or less. And so it's viewed that that is our friend, neighbor, and ally in the region. In addition, we gave them nuclear weapons during the Cold War. So make no mistake, Israel is a nuclear power. If there was, in fact, some sort of invasion by Israel that looked like it might actually topple Israel, would Israel's fire for it to survive, would it fire nukes? I mean, I don't know. If your people are the people that went through the Holocaust, you might very well say, well, we're not doing that again. And you might nuke in Iran. Or you might nuke, who's likely to go in there? In Egypt. So it's a real mess. It's a real mess. Still to this day, there's violence on a regular basis. Again, terrorist activities, governmental retaliation, back and forth. You go search on the internet, you'll find 50 people blaming each side. So I'm going to leave it to that. But that is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Are there any further questions about anything else as we approach 9:30? You're allowed to say yes. You don't have to say no. I'm happy to keep going. No one has to stay. All right, shall we do one final code word then for tonight? Let's make the code word French Revolution. All right, well, we'll do the code word first, and then if people want to go, we'll make the French Revolution the final thing we do tonight. Because it is sort of the start of the course, so it is valid stuff. Tonight's code word, the last word, is going to be vampire bat. Vampire bat, because I fought a vampire bat, we'll call it vampire bat. Yes, it was a vampire bat. It was huge. It tried to suck my blood, and it will no longer be a danger to me or myself. So if you write in vampire bat over the next 30 seconds, I'm going to keep in mind I have a 7-second delay here this time. I will give you more extra credit. How many people made it to the end? We had 41 at the top. We're down to 29. Not bad. Not bad. All right, 7 seconds from the moment I say this. I'm going to cut it. All right, that's it. Yeah, the bat's gone. I can neither confirm or deny the fate of the bat, except it is no longer a threat. So, French Revolution. Okay, this will be the last thing and then we'll be done. French Revolution is 3 issues. First off, number 1, the inequality politically between the estates system. Now, estates is actually a French word, estate, right? And it just refers to the state of being. Like, what is your state? It's literally the same thing as the Costa system, except doing it, instead of by race, it does it by occupation. It's a medieval system. This is a major problem. You have a medieval system where people really were only 3 things. In the medieval era of Europe, people either fought, prayed, or worked. That was it. The people who prayed were your priests. The people who fought were your aristocrats and your aristocratic warrior class, the knights. And then you had the workers, who were the peasants. And that was it. The problem is that system stayed in place. And although and over time the aristocracy became less warriors and more landlords, and the priests, well, stayed priests, and then the peasant class became all kinds of stuff because that was everybody else. So you had peasant farmers, but you also had laborers who lived in cities and weren't peasants at all, but still were in that class. And most important to the French Revolution, in this era of 1750 or so, you have a growing group of Enlightenment trained, Enlightenment educated middle class people called the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie were effectively a group of professional class people, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, factory owners, etc., and sundry other professions, who were able to generate similar wealth as a noble could being a landlord, but did it through labor every day, right? So if you were a lawyer, a barrister, let's say, a barrister in that time of France did not simply sit on their ass and collect money. A landlord did. A noble was noble because they didn't work. That was sort of a hallmark of being a noble. You collected your rents. Okay. Well, a lawyer can't not work and still get paid. So what you had was you had an incredible amount of resentment that builds up. This same resentment is a cause of the French Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, by the way, where people who viewed themselves, the middle class viewed themselves, as just as ethically and morally equal to the aristocrats. So you could make an argument. You could make an argument that an educated person is more important than a non-educated person. Why would I say that? Because you could say, I'm not saying this, but you could say that, well, in a system where people are contributing to society, an educated person has a more to contribute than a person who just has their labors. Okay. Now, keep in mind, in the American system of today, everyone's educated more than any people in those days would have been. Okay. Like, your average education in America is profoundly more than most humans have ever had. So you can't use us as a modern analog of that. But in those days, an education was a major separator. So if you were an educated individual, but you came from middle class background, and your education actually led you to a profession that paid well, doctor, lawyer, silversmith, whatever it might be. Or maybe you ran a business, maybe you ran a dyeing facility or a clothing loom, a textile loom or something. You could certainly see the moral outrage you would have in saying, wait a minute, I work every day. I am rich, I am wealthy, I am smart, I am capable, I'm a good leader. I've done more with my life than the aristocrat's done with his. And yet the aristocrat pays no taxes, has more political power, more political rights, and I have to live the same way a peasant farmer lives? Why is that? And that resentment builds. 2, grain prices. The price of grain skyrockets because grain was in short supply. A number of famines had occurred. Not famines, but bad harvests had occurred for a number of reasons. War debts had built up tremendously. Oh, that's really number 3. We'll get to that. So anyway, the price of bread had gone through the roof. Now you might say, it's just bread. Yeah, but that's what everybody ate. I mean, you have to be in a world where you have to understand people ate bread at every meal, and it was the only thing they had. Having meat once a week in a stew, because stew would last and go further, you could stretch it thinner. That would be about it for anyone in anything below the middle class. So most people ate bread every day. So if bread became more expensive, it was like saying your entire food bill became uneatable, unaffordable. And third, France had massive war debts from Louis XIV engaging in a whole bunch of expansionist wars, most of whom failed and never got anywhere. So that brought the new king, King Louis XVI, to have to try and generate revenue to pay off the debts. So his plan was simple. Call together a meeting of the estates, get them all in his palace of Versailles, and he assumed if he simply went to tax the nobles, the priest class would approve because they don't care about the nobles, and the peasant class would approve because they don't care about the nobles, and he'd be able to get money from the nobles and pay off the war debt. This was his plan. He fails in doing this because he forgets that the priests come from the same families as the nobles. They're all bought positions, right? No one No one who was an archbishop of the Catholic Church in those days started as Father Tom in the local church. That never happened. They were aristocrat's kid. The aristocrat paid the church a bunch of money and maybe gave them some land. And little Timmy went from being Timmy the noble to Timmy the priest. No, excuse me, Timmy the bishop. All right, some high-ranking position within the church. So these guys were all in the same family. So the idea that the nobles and the priests were going to have a disagreement over this was simply not true. It was bonkers, very bad calculation by the king. So what they actually do instead is they turn on the king. And they use this meeting and the rules of this Estates General meeting to try to force reforms on the king that reduce the king's power. In the middle of all this, of course, there are no peasants there at the meeting at all, because peasants can't afford to take days off work. So instead, they can't afford to travel to the king's palace. So instead, the people representing the peasant class, the third estate, are actually the middle class. And the middle class actually want to rule the whole system. So in a meeting where it's mostly the very, very rich elites of society, a very small sliver of all the people, maybe 10% are represented there, a series of events, I can't go to every last one of them right now, results in the Palace of Versailles being taken over by the bourgeoisie middle class, physically taken over. The king is held there as a semi-prisoner, and then eventually executed for trying to flee the country. And this sparks the French Revolution, where you have a series of groups of people trying to seize power and take over within the government. There's many different constitutions, many different leaders. There's a series of wars with other European nations that don't go pretty well for France, and then later go better for France. And the whole system ends up with bloodshed, murder, mayhem, and then eventually the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte to become the Emperor of France, solidifying the fact that the French Revolution accomplished absolutely nothing effectively in its own destiny. It tried to remove a king and instead ended up with an emperor. Well done, gang. What you can say, though, it did do is because of Napoleon's conquests, the system of the French government at the time, which was democratic, at least on paper, was spread throughout Europe. The Napoleonic Code, which was a law code based on Enlightenment principles, and the Napoleon system for economic trade and so forth, all helped to spread Enlightenment ideals throughout Europe and would actually trigger a series of other revolutions going forward and definitely help to sort of kill, finally, this idea of absolutism. So that's the legacy of the French Revolution in a nutshell. Mia Michael Quintet. That's fine. No problem. Going back up. Did you actually burn it, though? Burn what? Oh, the bat? No, I didn't burn the bat. Nah, it's dead. Is it, though? Unfortunate. He deserved it. All right, Tyler Caros. I don't know who you are, but I like your hardcore attitude. Okay, gang. We're going to call it there. So thank you very much for tuning in. We'll do this again on Monday night. We'll try to stick to different sorts of topics. If it doesn't look like it's very popular, it goes shorter, that's fine. And then Wednesday night before the exam, we'll do actually going over the writing sections, what you need to do to score points, okay? How you do it, what needs to be there, a template you can memorize and put right down on paper. All right, gang, so we're going to call it. Have a good one. I'm shutting it down. Good night.